Mike, we've got some unanswered questions from the people here, and we hope.
I'm shocked and amazed after 3 weeks. Go ahead.
Yeah. So
I'm sure you got something.
I hope you got some answers ready, because we've got lots of questions, and all about Melchizedek himself. So, Mike, the number one question from everybody all over the internet, all over the world: could Melchizedek have been Shem, son of Noah?
Come on, how many people really ask that?
I've seen videos.
Did you get more than one?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, there's videos all over YouTube.
Why would anybody think that Melchizedek is Shem? I mean, my answer to that is no. There's no reason to think they're the same person. There's nothing in the Old Testament that connects them in any way. So why would the equation even pop into somebody's head? I mean, their lives could have overlapped chronologically a little bit, but there's just not a shred of evidence to say they're the same person. So I'm pretty shocked. I don't know why that would be something in the forefront of anybody's mind.
I don't know. A lot of people talk about if he was still alive. A lot of people think he is still alive during that time. And
great. Me and you are alive at the same time. We're not the same person.
What?
I mean,
what? I know one's a champion, one is not. So very true.
Yeah. Okay. Hope you got something better than that.
Okay, so you're done just like that.
I'm done just like that. I mean,
okay, wow.
There is no trail to pursue there.
Okay,
great. Isn't an iota of evidence for that.
Okay. Second question is from Daryl from Sherwood, Alberta, Canada. And believe it or not, several other people have tracked on this too. And they want to know, is it possible that the physical person Melchizedek is Job?
Wait, is this like, it's almost like, what's my line here? There's a little bit more to this because Job is, the book's just kind of strange. And frankly, a lot of people assume certain things about Job that they shouldn't assume. But again, there's no textual basis for Melchizedek, the Melchizedek figure who meets Abraham being Job. There's no reason to suspect that Melchizedek is Job. Again, if that's the point of the question, and it sounds like it. I know some people will say, well, hey, Melchizedek did priestly things, before there was a priesthood, and so did Job. Job offered sacrifices. Well, great. Guess what? Before there was a Levitical priesthood, which of course covered hundreds and hundreds of years, even in relationship to the history of the Israelites, lots of people, were offering sacrifices. There's no reason to suspect that their identities overlap just because they perform a certain duty. So I would say, again, with complete confidence, there's no textual basis for the idea. Again, lots of people perform priestly duties in the patriarchal era. Why? Because there was no priesthood. Job, I think we should add, was also geographically removed from Canaan. So again, there's no reason to suspect that he's Melchizedek. To be fair, though, there were probably two places called Uz in the Bible. If you look it up, just concord it, in software, like I have, or Strong's or something like that. One Uz was the homeland of the daughter of Edom. That's Lamentations 4:21. Okay, so there's an association that Uz was in Edom. Okay, Edom is in the Transjordan. All right, it's nowhere near Canaan proper. Where Abraham was running around, chasing Lot all the way up to Damascus. I mean, it's a considerable distance away, and where he would have met, Melchizedek again on the one side of the Jordan. Edom is on the other side of the Jordan and to the south. That's Lamentations 4:21. You get the same sort of context in Genesis 36. Again, specifically in verse 4, Eliphaz is a descendant of Esau or Edom. Again, Eliphaz, showing up in the book. Go to Genesis 36:1. Again, Edom and Esau are tied together there. So there is an association of a place, Uz, and certain other factors in the book of Job with Edom. So that alone, again, would sort of disqualify, the whole Melchizedek thing. Now, one little oddity, again, if you do concord Uz, in Jeremiah 25:20, there's an Uz linked with the land of the Philistines. Again, that's nowhere near Edom as well. That's on the coast. Again, it's still not where Abraham is, but you have a totally different location. Again, it's just kind of bizarre. You're on the coast, you go up a little bit northward, and you start running into Syria. You've got the Syria thing with Aram. Aram is the biblical word for Syria. That's kind of interesting because if you go to Genesis 10:23, for instance, you have the sons of Aram, Uz. Again, a person now is listed as the sons of Aram. That's in the area of Syria. So you've got at least two places that are called Uz in different locations than where Abraham is. You also have a person, again, associated with being in the area of Syria. So again, you got more than one Uz, and none of them can really be specifically tied to where Abraham is. So I don't see really any hope of a coherent connection between the events of the book of Job or Job himself with Abraham, and then of course then with Melchizedek.
Elizabeth from New Mexico. In Dr. Heiser's book, The Unseen Realm, on page 102, it states many of the Apkallu were considered evil. If only many, but not all, of the Apkallu, could it be that Melchizedek could still be of that origin and intentionally set aside by God to set the record the way straight again?
Well, again, there's no reference to Melchizedek being a divine being or even partially a divine being. We talked about that a lot in the first installment. Melchizedek, he's a guy. He's not a divine being. He's never called an Apkallu. That's not even a biblical word. And in Unseen Realm, when I'm talking about some of the Apkallu, or even many of them being considered evil, that's a comment about Mesopotamian thought. In Mesopotamian texts, you have the cuneiform material. You have the Apkallu being good guys because the Mesopotamians love the thought that their knowledge comes from the gods. But then they also show up in witchcraft texts. They're called in the Maklu series of Akkadian texts. So there also can be sinister figures as well. So that comment was really aimed at Mesopotamian material, nothing really that has anything to do with the Bible. You're going to have ancient traditions in other parts of the world that associate knowledge with the gods. That's nothing unusual. But that you can't take such an idea and say, oh, these are the Apkallu. These you can't really do that. You need some sort of textual association with that wisdom tradition, maybe connecting it to a flood story. Well, then you might have some reason to suspect that one culture's text is talking about this same incident or this same era, and thus the same idea with another culture. If they're both talking about the flood, in other words, if the context is the same. But as far as Melchizedek being connected, to any of this, again, he's never referred to in the Old Testament as being divine or partially divine, and of course, he's not going to be referred to as an Apkallu because it's not a biblical term anyway. And Melchizedek, to be kind of honest about it, his name, has to do with righteousness. Again, if you take it adjectively or descriptively, why would we think that Melchizedek was so wise? I mean, he's never really referred to as a super wise person. He's the priest of the Most High God. Okay, my name is Tzedek and all that kind of stuff. But there's actually nothing in the biblical tradition to connect him, specifically with any of that. So my answer would be no. I don't see anything there.
James wants to know if there is a connection between Metatron and Melchizedek in the Second Temple period.
Oh yeah, there is. I would recommend, if people who are really interested in this to, if you're interested enough just to read, a few paragraphs, then Charlesworth's Old Testament Pseudepigrapha Volume 1, because that's where the Book of Enoch is in that 2-volume set. He's going to have some material on Melchizedek and Metatron. If you're really interested in it, Andrei Orlov, who is now David Burnett's advisor at Marquette, has a whole book on Enoch and the Metatron tradition. So if you're really, really into it, that would be the thing to read. But let me pull something up from Charlesworth here. This is from, like I said, his first volume, Old Testament Pseudepigrapha. He writes, a number of clear parallels between heavenly Melchizedek of Qumran and the Metatron of Third Enoch at once suggest themselves. Okay, this is in his discussion of Third Enoch. Both figures hold exalted, if not preeminent, positions among the angels, for instance. Both are heavenly judges. Metatron's court is mentioned in 3rd Enoch 16:1. And both apparently had earthly lives prior to their exalted heavenly states. when you start talking about Metatron and you start talking about third Enoch, you're also going to get a relationship between Metatron and Enoch. Now, the question was specifically about Melchizedek and Metatron, and again, just that little section from Charlesworth gives you a few of the indications about how the two are related. Again, the bigger relationship, though, is between Enoch and Metatron, and we don't really need to dive into that because Enoch and Melchizedek were not the same figure, so it might be confusing to go into the Enoch Metatron connections. Let's just restrict our comments here to Melchizedek. And again, there are a few of them. I should also say about Third Enoch. Third Enoch is a late text. It is grouped, in the Second Temple literature. Obviously, it's in Charlesworth's first volume here, Old Testament pseudepigrapha. But the date of Third Enoch is going to be after the era of the New Testament, certainly. It's written entirely in Hebrew. Again, but it gets the name Third Enoch because a lot of its content is like First Enoch and, of course, like Second Enoch as well. But there's going to be new stuff in here. And the Metatron material is chiefly tied to the third book of Enoch and not the others. But you're obviously going to get some things in there. But as far as the specific question, is there a relationship between Melchizedek and Metatron? Yeah, they're exalted mediator figures. Again, the sort of second power in heaven candidates. Again, if you remember some of the discussions that we've had here on the podcast, I know this is taken a lot for granted because I can't assume everybody's listened to all the episodes, but you may have also recalled this from maybe something in Unseen Realm or something on my website, twopowersinheaven.com. There was a lot of speculation in the Second Temple period between, or among, I should say, Jewish writers as to who the second Yahweh figure was. And some opted for an exalted angel. Others opted for a deified or a glorified human. Okay, so right there you have sort of the foundation of the connection. Melchizedek was one of those figures in Second Temple literature that could either be conceived of, and to get sort of the full feel for this, you need to listen to the second installment of our Melchizedek series. But Melchizedek could sort of fit in either category. Either he was considered a human being that was then exalted, and he becomes this second Yahweh figure in some Jewish text. Others would say, there's something going on here about Melchizedek that he might have been a divine being. So then he'd fall into the second category of having an angel occupy the second Yahweh figure slot. So Melchizedek sort of gets discussed for the same reason, but in terms of both of those categories. And Metatron, of course, is an exalted angel. But he's also this deified human figure. He's Enoch transformed into an angel. So in that respect, yeah, there's a relationship between Melchizedek and Metatron. And in that respect, again, being second power in heaven candidates, there's a relationship also between Melchizedek, Metatron, and Enoch, if you want to look at it that way. But, I think that's sufficient for here where we're at in the Q&A. The figure of Metatron and the figure of Melchizedek do overlap in that respect. They are sort of exalted, figures in Second Temple literature, specifically Third Enoch, which is a later text.
Vidal asked a question, and it's, Canaan was cursed because of Ham's sin. Is this one of those cases where a curse became a blessing? He was ordered by the patriarch to not be raised by his loser of a father's house, but be raised in the homes of his godlier uncles. Could this have resulted in a healthy respect and love for Yahweh? Could this have been passed down to a son and grandson that may have been called Melchizedek? Could Melchizedek have been one of many descendants of Canaan that were living in the land and still worshiped Zedek and lived in peace with a fellow follower of Yahweh, Abraham? I realize that this is conjecture, but is there any scripture or extra biblical sources that could refute this possibility?
Well, that's really oddly worded. Correct. It's totally conjecture, and there's absolutely no substance to it at all. So to ask, are there texts that refute it? Well, of course not, because no one was thinking it. I mean, that's like, are there texts that refute that pigs can fly? Well, of course not. So the question is kind of worded a little bit oddly. I'm not sure that's what the questioner wanted. We did an episode on the curse of Canaan, the whole Genesis 9 thing. And I would even add that that the characterization of the curse in the question is a bit misguided. I mean, Canaan's not cursed so that he wouldn't be raised by losers. Okay, and the godlier uncles thing is a little questionable, especially because Ham. Ham was the father of Canaan. We get that. Godlier uncles, well, maybe not. I mean, but that wasn't the point of the curse. The Bible never tells us in direct language. It never sort of defines or unlocks, explicitly describes what the curse of Canaan was directly. Although in the episode that we discussed, the implications of the curse are pretty clear. Canaan is cursed because Ham committed maternal incest with his mother, Noah's wife, and so Canaan was the product of that. That's why the text in Genesis 9 stresses that Canaan, was the son of Ham, and Ham was Canaan's father. So I would refer the questioner back to that episode. And now, if that's the case, and I think it's certainly the most exegetically defensible view, that we have a case of maternal incest and then Canaan is the product of that, then the curse of Canaan meant that his status, was illegitimate. He was the illegitimate son of Ham by virtue of his mother, and so he would not inherit the leadership of the tribe when Noah passed on. So the curse wasn't about not having him raised by losers and having him raised by better people. That just isn't even in the view, or really, it's just not in the picture. So I don't really know what else to do, again, with the question. None of this has anything to do with Melchizedek. I guess maybe that's a good way to sort of wrap this up. There's no textual support for Melchizedek being from the line of Canaan because there's no lineage for Melchizedek ever given. That was the point of part of his description, in later Second Temple text, later New Testament, the whole without father, without mother, sort of thing. That was about his priesthood not deriving from a specific lineage, a specific line, a specific tribe. So you couldn't say that if he had a lineage in the Old Testament, and he doesn't. So there's no way to trace Melchizedek back to Canaan. It would be, as the questioner said, it's entirely speculative.
All right, Tim from Wisconsin, Shannon from Great Bend, Kansas, and Henry, an Ethiopian Orthodox Christian from Northamptonshire, England, UK, are all tracking on the same thing here. And they want to know if there is a connection to the bread and wine offering from Melchizedek to Abraham in Genesis 14 to Melchizedek being a prototype of Jesus.
Yeah, I think there is. I think it's part of the typology. We didn't get into the specific elements of the typology in the third installment in the Melchizedek series because we're going to do that in the book of Hebrews. So, we cut some of that out, but I would say, yeah, the short answer is sure. I mean, that he serves, bread and wine. He becomes a typological figure again for certainly, certainly Jesus for New Testament writers. He also has, something of a mediatorial role in Second Temple text, but specific to the New Testament, I do think if you're looking at Melchizedek and you're thinking of Jesus, this is going to be part of it. So I would say, yeah, that's a good trajectory. It's something we're going to get into a little bit more when we hit that point in the book of Hebrews. But yeah, that's a good observation.
All right, the next one is from P, the letter P as in Paul. P, I have no idea other than just P, Mike, sure. So it's P.
It's like the P source, JEDP. So hey.
So here we go. P wants to know, did the other nations conceptualize the God of the Israelites with their own gods like El, Anu, or maybe Zedek? In Abraham's encounter with God in Haran, would he have thought of God as an Anu-like figure from his time in the third dynasty of Ur? How do we view this Anu-El figure in relation to God?
Well, how do we view this Anu-El figure in relation to God? It's hard for me to hear sentences like that and know how to parse them. There's no direct, in the Hebrew Bible anyway, there's no direct connection between the term El and Anu. But Anu is just the God of heaven. And of course, Old Testament thinking would assume that the God of Israel is the God of heaven. So, there's I don't know. I don't know if the questioner is looking for some sort of linguistic link. There's not, but there's certainly a conceptual link. I mean, every civilization is going to imagine that the gods, again, either live in the skies or on mountains, or in the seas. These places that humans don't live, that are inaccessible and frankly lethal or to human life, that sort of thing. So, sure, any given ancient person, you could have run into an Akkadian or a Sumerian, and he'd have been talking about the God of heaven, and somebody could have run into that. Oh, well, that Yahweh's the God of heaven. You're in Canaan now, and we worship Yahweh here, and so sure, there's going to be some sort of conceptual connection. Every pantheon, has the gods, or I would say most of the gods are probably going to be, at least the high gods are going to be in heaven. You can have gods on earth and under the earth and all that sort of thing. So every pantheon is going to have that. Every pantheon is going to have at least one or a pair, or let's just say like an oligarchy, a small group of gods that are sort of above the other ones. And even in polytheistic systems, even within the oligarchy, you're going to have one that's sort of has primacy of place. Maybe that one's the creator or something like that. But it's actually really difficult because, like in Mesopotamia, you have olden gods that were like the elements, the physical elements of the earth. Okay, one was earth, one was water, one was wind, one was you have these sort of the primeval stuff out of which reality is made. Well, they're all gods, and they all pre-exist. From when all that stuff sort of takes form. When the gods decide to become active in the place where humans live. Of course, they have to create that place first. But so it's a little hard to isolate a sky god to some level of primacy, because all of these things are absorbed into Yahweh in the Hebrew Bible. We're not talking about an original pair. We're not talking about Yahweh being isolated to heaven, or Yahweh being associated only with that place. Whereas On might be a high god, he might be the God of heaven, but is he the God of earth? No, that's somebody else. Again, there are these disconnects that are just inherent within the systems. And so to draw equivalences is really, really tenuous, and frankly, I would say inadvisable. So I would say it's sort of pure speculation to say XYZ deity was in XYZ religion Yahweh. In other words, if you ran into somebody in the ancient world, and you could sort of like lay out, you had them on trading cards or something, all the deities, and it's pure speculation on our part that your ancient person would see a deity name and say, oh, that one is this one. So your deity here is this one over here in my land. Again, there might be conceptual connections, but there's going to be disconnections that are significant as well. So it's really tenuous. It's a really sort of hard game to play. Frankly, you can really only strike analogies. And even the creator deity is a difficult analogy because of the original pairs and olden gods. And let's take Egypt. Even within Egypt, you have different gods that are perceived as creators, and then later on they all get merged to sort of fix that problem, or fix that confusion. And it's just really hard, other than speaking sort of in analogical terms, in very general analogical terms, to say, well, this deity in this ancient Near Eastern religion corresponds directly to Yahweh, because Yahweh subsumes all of them, all of their attributes, all of the places that they're associated with. So is that a correlation? Well, kind of, sort of. Is it a disconnection? Yeah, kind of, sort of that too. So I wouldn't go beyond that. I mean, there's no evidence for Yahweh, by name, in any other ancient Near Eastern text in terms of that text's religion, or that religion's pantheon. This is another good. I'll just open up DDD here. DDD has, in the entry on Yahweh, actually goes through it and kind of summarizes this issue, this problem. I'll read a little bit from Vandertorn here. He says, there's no evidence for Yahweh in other ancient Near Eastern texts, again, so on and so forth, blah, blah, blah. The abbreviated, or he's going to use a fancy academic term here, the abbreviated or hypochoristic form of the name betray regional predilections. Thus, U, or like YW, in Neo-Assyrian sources is especially found in a North Israelite context. In other words, when you find YW in an Assyrian text? Well, they get it because they've run into Israelites in the north, and then they talk about that deity. It's not because YW is a member of the Assyrian pantheon, and that's where the Israelites get it. It's actually the other way around. The Assyrians run into this, and then they write about it in their texts. But you don't have a text that would like list a Yahweh equivalent in an Assyrian pantheon. But you do see the names show up in places, YW, YH, in these kind of texts, because they run into each other. And then the Assyrians will be writing about something they did, and they'll mention the God of the Israelites, and they'll use that name. That's why anything that looks like a Yahweh name shows up in any ancient Near Eastern text. He does not show up as though he's a member of their pantheon. So there's no like there's no mention of him in a pantheon, and there's no there's no text that actually lists out deities and then does a comparison for us so that we would actually know. Again, there's the best you can do is just talk about analogies, and you have to acknowledge that the really significant disconnects as well. In Egyptian texts, Van der Toorn gets into this. Well, before we get there, he has a nice little comment about Ebla. This is something you're going to see on the internet that is just bluster. He says, before 1200 BCE, the name Yahweh is not found in any Semitic text. The stir caused by Petanato, for example, at Ebla, that's Ebla, and its relationship or its perceived relationship of those texts to the Bible, is basically misguided. He says, the stir caused by Petanato, who claimed to have found the shortened form of the name Yahweh, Yah specifically, as a divine element in theophoric names from Ebla, is unfounded. Now, you should know, listeners to this podcast should know what a theophoric name is, because we've been talking about Melchizedek. It's a name that includes the name of a deity in it. So Van der Toorn is referencing Petanato's work, like in the 80s, when he was working in Ebla text. He said, I found the name Yahweh in it as a theophoric name in Ebla text. And later on, scholars, who looked at Petanato's work and were doing their own work in the Ebla texts, discovered that no, that's really not the case. Continuing with Van der Toorn, he says, as the final element of personal names, Yah, Y-A, is often a hypochoristic ending, not a theonym. In other words, it's not a divine name, it's a hypochoristic ending. What's a hypochorism? A hypochorism is a diminutive form of a name. It's like a pet name. And we actually have good examples in English that actually use a Y at the end, kind of like Ebla did, using a Yah at the end. Like if we have the name Bill and then we put a Y on it, Billy. We take Bill, which is sort of, it feels more adult, more masculine, and then we have Billy, and that makes it sound like a kid, or it's a pet name. That's what a hypochorism is. And a hypochoristic ending there would be the letter Y. Melissa gets changed to Missy. Okay, there's another example. A little bit more of a change going on there, but you get the Y at the end. That's what's going on here with the Yah element in names at Ebla. It is not a deity name. So it just doesn't occur. If you go to Egypt, I mentioned this earlier. You just scroll down here in Van der Toorn's entry because it's pretty long. He gets to we should mention Mesha because that is the one exception here to the chronology. Let's see. The earliest West Semitic text mentioning Yahweh specifically as a deity that's not biblical. Okay, the earliest West Semitic text mentioning Yahweh is the Victory Stela written by Mesha, the Moabite king from the 9th century BC. So that's the Moabite Stela, also known as the Mesha Stela. There are also 2 Egyptian texts that mention Yahweh. In these texts from the 14th and 13th centuries BC, Yahweh is neither connected with the Israelites nor is his cult located in Palestine, Canaan. The texts speak about Yahu, this is a quote now, Yahu in the land of the Shasu Bedouins, unquote. The one text is from the reign of Amenhotep III, it's 14th century BC, and the other is from the reign of Ramses II, 13th century BC. In the Ramses II list, the name occurs in a context which also mentions Seir. Again, that would be Edom. It may be tentatively concluded that this, quote, Yahu in the land of the Shasu Bedouins, unquote, is to be situated, therefore, in the area of Edom and Midian. Well, lo and behold, isn't that where we find the divine name revealed according to Scripture to Moses? He is Moses is there with Jethro shepherding this flock in Midian. Okay, well, that makes a lot of sense. He says, in these Egyptian texts, YHW, Yahoo, is used as a toponym. In other words, it's part of a place name. Yet a relationship with the deity by the same name is a reasonable assumption. That's all I'll read from Vandertorn. So there's just not much evidence of the name Yahweh as a deity anywhere in the ancient Near East. You get it as toponyms. You get it because the Akkadians or the Assyrians ran into Israelites, and then they write about the Israelite God. You don't get Yahweh in a list of deities in any other ancient Near Eastern religion. You just don't. And so therefore to try to say, well, this deity, from the Akkadian or the Sumerian pantheon is Yahweh, it is just pure speculation. It's guesswork. The only thing you can do is try to create some sort of conceptual analogies, like I tried to illustrate early on in the question. That's about the best you can do, but you got to be honest with the problems of doing that, the sort of the method problems and even the conceptual problems, because in a strictly monotheistic system, and where Yahweh is unique, let's put it that way. In a system like in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible, where Yahweh is species unique, he is one among Elohim, certainly, but he is unique, and he transcends everything. He is not limited to parts of the world or geographical regions like other deities are. It's really hard to compare that to anything else and make really coherent analogy, or make a real coherent connection. The best you can do, again, is this sort of analogous thinking.
All right. Our next question is from Dennis in Birmingham, Alabama. Realizing now that the name Zedek plays such a pivotal role in understanding the various issues involved in resolving the mysteries and questions surrounding how to understand the relevance and theological messaging of the person of Melchizedek, I can't help but wonder if the fact that the last king of Judah was named Zedekiah also has theological significance.
Well, I think the fairest way to answer this is it might. I mean, there's really no way to know for sure why the child was named this. You'd have to know if the parents were thinking something like, on one hand, we believe Yahweh is Tzedek and vice versa, so we're naming our child in honor of him, in honor of Tzedek or whatever. Okay, they could have been thinking that. They could also have been thinking this. We want to praise Yahweh's righteous character, so we're choosing this name. In other words, the second option wouldn't have anything to do with the deity name, Tzedek as a deity, but Tzedek as righteousness. It's just hard to know, again, what was going through the mind of the parents, a particular person, when they chose the name, unless we're actually told in Scripture. Sometimes we are, sometimes we're not. We just have to guess. And I think this is one of those. So yeah, it could have been some sort of statement, like that, but ultimately we don't know. We're still left with a couple of options.
All right, Meryl has a question. You stated several times that the Levitical priesthood was Plan B in response to Moses' unbelief. You refer to the incident in Exodus 4:10 through 16, where Aaron was commissioned as, quote, the mouthpiece of Moses, unquote. Yet this text does not explicitly state anything about or presuppose a future priesthood of Moses. Can you explain your reasoning behind this statement? If the Levitical priesthood via Aaron was Plan B, what then, in your estimation, was Plan A? Are you assuming that Moses and his progeny were to be the priestly tribe over the nation? Trying to understand your train of thought of this.
Yeah, I think you're getting sidetracked on thinking of Moses as a priest. Again, that really isn't the point. So there's not going to be any talk, about Moses being a priest or priesthood or anything like that. So you need to go back further than that to sort of understand the trajectory. The point was that from Eden, beginning in Eden, the pattern, as God is working with a human being in his relationship to other human beings, really at the beginning, all human beings. The point is that from Eden on, the pattern was to have a human be both a ruler, a king, ruler over God's creation. We're talking about Adam now. And also have that same person be a mediator to all other humans. Again, this was Adam's role. Okay, again, within the the patriarchal culture, even though male and female are created, equally at the same time and all that sort of stuff, or relatively at the same time anyway. Within this culture, being what it was, Adam would have been zeroed in on as the lead ruler and the lead mediator to his children. Again, he would have been the patriarchal figure. Think in the patriarchal mode, because the patriarch, you had the rulership, of the tribe, as it were, and also he would do the priestly duties. He'd offer sacrifice and whatnot. So this is a template that emerges all the way back, from Genesis all the way back to Eden. Adam played both roles. He was the ruler and the mediator to all other humans. Patriarchs picked that up later. The patriarch is the ruler of his people. Abraham is the progenitor of Israel. He would have been, when he was alive, he is leading the clan, he's leading the nation, so to speak, and he's also doing, priestly things. Well, that's going to get picked up by whoever inherits the leadership. Okay, you have Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, so on and so forth. And Jacob, of course, is renamed Israel, and he is going to. So you have over Israel, you have one person. You have one person who rules the nation, rules the tribe. Again, it's a much smaller scale at that point, and then also is in charge of being the mediator between his people, the nation, as it were, and God. And he occupies both roles, and so that is consistently the pattern. It actually takes us up to Egypt. And then we've got the years of slavery in Egypt, years of isolation there. And it's reasonable to assume that coming out of Egypt, Moses was to occupy this status, this same role. Moses is certainly got, was the intended mouthpiece. He's the intended leader. He's the one that gets charged with bringing them up out of Egypt. By definition, that's a priestly role and a rulership role. Now he goes, he meets with the elders of Israel in Egypt, because they're not descending into anarchy because Moses leaves Egypt or something like that. They still have leadership, obviously, among the people, and there's a whole lot more of them now than what there were before. But Moses, again, is called by God to play the same sort of role. He's the one from whom the people are going to get all their direction from. Why? Because he is the mediator between them and God. It's very obvious there. So it picks up where it left off through the figure of Moses, but then Moses hems and haws about playing the mediatorial role. He's the one who's supposed to represent the nation, not only before God, but also to present God's demand to Pharaoh. Again, he's the mediating. I don't want to do that. I'm there. I got this problem. I got that problem. And so God says, okay, well, I'll let Aaron do that, or we'll bring Aaron into the picture. That's what we're talking about here. We're not talking about, is there a verse that says Moses was supposed to be a priest? Well, no, there's not. But he's doing priestly things all up to that point. He is being a mediator between God and his people. That's what priests do. So he is a priest in that sense, but there's nothing spelled out about Moses, someday, fathering a line of priests and high priests and all that stuff. That isn't the point. So we shouldn't get distracted by looking for that or sort of wanting to see that or expecting that. It's this template of rulership. Again, authority might be a better way to put it, but the person in whom is the ultimate authority over the group. And then that same person playing the role of mediator between God and those people. And the template was consistently to have that in one person up until the time of Moses, where we get, again, the famous scene. And it's not just Exodus 4, it's Exodus 4 through 6. You have the same kind of, maybe cowardice might be too strong of a word, but you have the same kind of reticence or hesitation on Moses' part, same kind of unbelief on Moses' part when they get to Egypt, as we witnessed in Exodus 4 when they're on Sinai. And so out of that, the argument is the priesthood of Aaron comes into play to make up for Moses' weaknesses. And that's why a number of scholars view it as plan B or derivative or a concession. And I think, again, if you think about it in those terms, there's really something to be said for that. It makes good sense as to why now we have two figures in the era of Moses, when all the way up to this time we didn't have two, we had one. Again, it's mercy extended toward Moses, but the plan, God's ideal, going all the way back to Abraham again, who is blessed, by Melchizedek, and Melchizedek, priest of the Most High God. He's king of Salem. He foreshadows, Jerusalem. He foreshadows, priestly role there in Jerusalem, and being the king of Jerusalem. All that stuff we talked about with Melchizedek. He's a type of what is to come, and not only what is to come, but what God had preferred up to that point. One ruler over his family, his earthly family, his people, and one mediator. And again, I think, incidentally, this is why, it's important for Jesus to be not only a son of David, but a son of Abraham, tracing it back through Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, all the way back to Adam. This is what you get. The king, priest, Messiah is a return to the idea, and his lineage runs back to and through the patriarchs and Adam. And it doesn't, incidentally, run through the Mosaic line. Moses is not part of the lineage of Jesus, obviously, because Moses is not of the tribe of Judah. We get that. But again, there's this undercurrent, I think, going on too about what God's ideal was for how he would relate to his people and how he wanted his people governed, that goes all the way back to Eden, where both roles are fused into one.
Seth has our next question. In 1 Peter 2, 9 through 10, where it refers to us as a holy nation, royal priesthood, can this be seen more in the light of the priesthood of Melchizedek? It seems this passage is popularly understood in light of the Levitical priesthood, but when you stated the priesthood of Melchizedek is one of God's appointing and not one of the lineage, it would make more sense to view it in light of the priesthood of Melchizedek, which is also Christ's priesthood. Can you unpack that a bit and perhaps expound on the practical outwork?
Yeah, that's a really good observation, and I would agree again that there's something to that. And I wouldn't go as far to say that the priesthood of believers has nothing to do with the Levitical priesthood, because you do have Old Testament passages that get quoted that are very obviously contextually rooted in the Levitical system. But I also don't think that fact cancels out this Melchizedek angle. So on the one hand, let's just think about it. On the one hand, there's secure reason to link the priesthood of believers to the Old Testament priesthood by virtue of the Old Testament concept that Israel was to be a kingdom of priests. Well, those kind of statements are rooted, in Torah. They're rooted in the Mosaic context. But, there's even more to that. As we've talked about on this podcast a lot, as the church is the temple, so the church is also Israel in some sense. Again, we've talked a lot about that in earlier podcasts. Again, for people who would be new to the podcast, no, we don't articulate a rabid, dyed-in-the-wool, supersessionism here. I frustrate supersessionists because I do think there's a future for national Israel and all that kind of stuff. But yet we have this talk in the New Testament. So if you're interested, go back to earlier episodes. But you have the church as Israel in some sense, and therefore the church is the new kingdom of priests. Okay, so it is tied, to Israel, conceptually. You have this kingdom of priests idea, which is rooted in Torah. It's Exodus, chapter 19, verse 6. That's where it's drawn from. So we can't cut off the idea from the Levitical system of which these sort of statements are a part. We have the church being the new kingdom of priests, and it has to be, because the church is the kingdom already. It's appropriate to talk about the church, those of us in the church, as a kingdom of priests, because the church is in some sense the kingdom as well. Colossians 1:13, he has translated us into the kingdom of his dear son. Okay, it's a perfect tense, something that occurred already, but the implications are still ongoing. We get the already but not yet thing. Interestingly enough, though, for again, people who might be new to the podcast are thinking, well, we can only talk about the kingdom in the future, the book of Revelation. Mike, don't you understand dispensation? All that kind of stuff. Yeah, I understand it all. Have you looked at Revelation 1:6? Okay, Revelation 1:6. You actually have instances in the book of Revelation that say things like that God has made us a kingdom, priests to his God and Father. Okay, Christ has made us a kingdom, priest to his God and Father. To him be glory and dominion forever and ever. Amen. That's Revelation 1:6. Revelation 1:6 has believers being a kingdom of priests. Okay, this is before the so-called millennium passage of Revelation 20. Same thing again, in Revelation 1:9. I, John, your brother and partner in the tribulation, which apparently was already present, and the kingdom. and the patient endurance that are in Jesus. I mean, you get this language even in the book of Revelation. So the already but not yet is real. It's a phenomenon of Scripture. And ultimately, again, we can't divorce that from the Levitical system. Now, all that said, on the other hand, it makes sense to say, as extensions and constituent members of the body of Christ, we are members of Christ's priesthood, and he is a high priest after the order of Melchizedek. So there is something to this idea. 1 Peter 2:9, let's just look that up. You are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his own possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. Again, 1 Peter 2:9 is coherently linked to Exodus 19:6, which had the Israelites in view, but there are other passages that suggest Gentiles are going to be made priests of God. Gentiles, which by definition can have no relationship to the tribe of Levi and its priesthood. Okay, the only way to quote unquote legitimize Gentiles being priests is if you have a different priesthood that isn't dependent on a specific tribe. That would be ergo the priesthood of Melchizedek. You have Isaiah 66, 18 through 23. Let me lift the passage up. I'll read it. For I know their works and their thoughts, and the time is coming to gather all nations and tongues, and they shall come and shall see my glory. And I will set a sign among them, and from them I will send survivors to the nations, to Tarshish, Pul, and Lud, who draw the bow, to Tubal and Javan, to the coastlands far away that have not heard my fame or seen my glory, and they shall declare my glory among the nations. And they shall bring all your brothers from all the nations as an offering to the Lord on horses and chariots and in litters and on mules and dromedaries to my holy mountain Jerusalem, just as the Israelites bring their grain offering in a clean vessel to the house of the Lord. And some of them also I will take for priests and for Levites, says the Lord. So you have this sense of the nations being, and that's just one passage. I mean, there are others, but you have this sense of the nations being incorporated into the family of God. And that when God does that, it's okay, again, that the Old Testament would use this language of some of those people from the nations being made priests and Levites. That's okay. Why? Because in New Testament theology, this regathering is a reference to the building up, the creation of, and the building up of the body of Christ. And again, we are all, Jew or Gentile, are members of the body of Christ. And that means, again, just, by definition, you have Gentiles being members of the body of Christ, and Christ is the high priest after the order of Melchizedek. So it makes sense to say that we are extensions of that. So I think there is something to this idea, but I wouldn't say that it sort of excludes or sort of does away with the other connection. I think let's put it this way. This is a theme we're going to get in the book of Hebrews once we jump into it, beginning, very, very soon. It supersedes what was in the Old Testament. It doesn't say to us that we shouldn't look at this anymore. We should seek to erase connections back to the old system. It supersedes it. It's better. It's more comprehensive. It's better in some way. It's superior. And that's a big theme in the book of Hebrews. So this whole notion about being the high priest after the order of Melchizedek, if we're members of that body, we are extensions of that. And so we can't help but be connected to that priesthood because Christ is connected to that priesthood.
Sebastian from Amsterdam, the Netherlands, wants to know if Dr. Heiser said that Melchizedek's name for the Most High God could be Zedek, and that Abraham's name for the Most High God is El, Elohim, El Shaddai, implying that Zedek and El are both names for the same deity, Yahweh. If God disinherited the nations of Babylon and started his own family with Abraham, how could Yahweh still be Melchizedek's Most High God?
I would say because anybody could choose to worship the true God. It would depend on them learning of the true God, the Most High God. Remember, after Babel, Abram was an outsider. There was no Israel. Abram was just as on the periphery as everybody else. So if we're asking, well, how could Melchizedek worship the Most High God? We could also ask, how could Abraham worship the Most High God? Because they're both on the outs. There is no people of God after Babel until God starts one. Now he goes to Abraham. He reveals himself to Abram, spelling Abram in that particular chapter. He reveals himself to Abram, whose family were polytheists. Again, this is post-Babel situation. You have a lot of time elapsed between Babel, and when we get to the time period of Abraham or Abram, again in Scripture, it's chapter 11, and the next chapter is 12. I mean, but if you look at the chronology of the situation, you got a good amount of time, and we know from Genesis 11:31 and 32, Abraham's father is Terah. You go to Joshua 24:2, Terah is a polytheist. Okay, this is the context out of which Abram comes from, like everybody else. So if we're going to ask how could this be with Melchizedek, we also have to ask how could this be with Abram? And the answer is God revealed himself to Abram. Abram had to believe. Abram had to choose, believe in the Most High God. And so we have to assume, and we don't have a verse for Melchizedek's conversion out of polytheism. We don't have anything like that. But he's in the same context as Abram. So we have to assume that it would have worked the same way. Somehow Melchizedek learns of the Most High God and chooses to believe in him and becomes a priest in his service. He's a priest of the Most High God. We just don't have specific information as to, like we do with Abraham, or at least we have a little bit with Abram. We don't have specific information for Melchizedek. We don't have his story. We don't have his testimony. We just know that he worshiped Yahweh. He worshiped the Most High.
Keith from upstate New York has a question, and it is, assuming the name Melchizedek is theophorical, and we are to understand that this title, King of Righteousness, is similar to the word Christ, meaning anointed one, Jesus is a first name. Is there any evidence that Melchizedek may have had a first name?
The connection is kingship, anointed one. Well, anointed to do what? Of course, in the messianic sense, that would be anointed to be king. So there is a connection here. So there is something to discuss here. But Christos, was not a last name. But nevertheless, I follow the thought. In the first century, Jesus' full name would have been something like Jesus, son of Joseph. It wasn't Jesus Christ. Okay, that Christ is a title. Again, it's a title. If you want to call it an epithet, I guess you could call it that too. But Jesus Christ means Jesus, the one who is the Christ, the one who is the anointed one. Okay, so it's not a last name; it's a title. Melchizedek, again, isn't really. One of the options is that Melchizedek, just the whole thing, is a title. So if Melchizedek, as we talked about in the first installment, was nothing more than a title, then the guy who bore that title, his name would have been XYZ, whose king is righteous, or something like that. XYZ, Melchizedek. And then again, being translated, my king is righteous. So it's not quite the same thing, when it comes to an equivalence between Melchizedek and Jesus, but it's not totally different either. You have, again, Christ being descriptive of Jesus of Nazareth, and if you take Melchizedek as a title, it's not really descriptive in terms of Melchizedek isn't described as the one being righteous, whereas Jesus is described as the one who is the Christ. Okay, so there's a bit of a disconnect there. But again, I follow the thought, that if we take Melchizedek as a title, okay, we have Christ as a title, maybe there's something going on there. So that's the way I would end it. I would say it's not quite the same thing because in Jesus' sake, the title is also self-referential. In Melchizedek's case, that's not the case. XYZ guy whose name is Melchizedek or who whose king is righteous. Again, it's talking about somebody else. It's not talking about the guy who bears the title. So there's a bit of a disconnect there. But they could both be titles. It's just that the trajectory, the thought trajectory, would operate in a slightly different direction. One is self-referential. The other is referring to somebody else who the bearer of that title serves.
Our last question is from Daryl. Did God lead Abraham to Melchizedek's altar in Salem to sacrifice Isaac?
Well, there's no direct textual reason to make the association specifically. Now, I hope it's obvious to a lot of listeners where the question comes from. I mean, you can make a circumstantial case for not. How do I say this? The question suggests or requires too much specificity, too much precision. Okay, here's what I mean. So Abraham goes to offer Isaac. Now, according to Genesis 22, verse 2, let's just read it. God tells Abraham, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. Okay. So here, Moriah is a land. Okay, it's not a mountain, it's a land. So right away we have a bit of a disconnect because Solomon, according to 2 Chronicles 3:1, is going to build the temple on Moriah, and it's on a mountain because it's on Mount Zion. Okay, but back in Genesis 22, Moriah is a land. And if you're looking at the circumstances of his life, like following where he's gone, it's about 3 days travel from where he's at. Okay, so he travels to Moriah, this land, and he's instructed to go to this land and sacrifice Isaac on one of the mountains there. The mountain is not specified. Moriah is not a mountain in Genesis 22, and Moriah has more than one mountain. So which one did Abraham pick? I don't know. We're not told. So the question sort of assumes, with, let's be honest, no textual basis, the question assumes that the very same mountain that Abraham wound up at with Isaac is the same mountain that Solomon builds the temple on. There's really no way to prove that. There's really no way to establish that. You have the names are the same, Moriah, but again, the Moriah of Abraham had several mountains. Jerusalem itself, where the temple is one mountain. Now, there are mountains around Jerusalem in the surrounding area. We learn that from verses like Psalm 125:3. They're just, how can I say this again without messing it up too much? Again, there's mountains, surrounding Jerusalem. Jerusalem itself, is associated with a mountain, Zion. There's no way to know that particular mountain, even though 2 Chronicles 3:1 says that the temple is built on Moriah, there's no way to know that particular mountain is the mountain that Abraham went to when he went to the land of Moriah and wound up on one of the mountains there. Again, you can see the obvious association because of the terms, but we just don't have the kind of precision that the question sort of assumes and requires. So we can't really be much more precise than that. So that's why I said I can't just say yes to this question. I could say maybe, possibly, could be, but beyond that, we just don't have any sort of biblical textual material to be any more precise.